This lecture will be about the World Trade Organization system, and the goal is really twofold. One is to lay out the institutional structure of this system that governs much of the world's trade, and also to give some historical context for that, and also to outline some of the basic principles that underlie the system. So a couple of basic facts about the WTO. First, that it's headquartered in Geneva, and one should see it as the successor to the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. A lot of people will say that the WTO started in 1995, but it had an important predecessor in the GATT, and as we'll see that it really built on the system that was in place from the late 1940s. Currently, as of 2013, there are 159 nations that are full members of the WTO. And as I just mentioned, it was a successor to the GATT, which was an organization really established in sort of an ad hoc way after the International Trade Organization failed in the immediate post-war period. It was originally going to be part of the so-called Bretton Woods system involving the IMF, the World Bank, and the ITO. For various reasons, the ITO did not get started, but there was an agreement, a text about how to deal with trade embodied in what was called the GATT. So it was originally a piece of paper. It became an institution. Now, the GATT system that was in place for a number of decades after World War II was very much focused on a particular aspect of trade, that is goods trade, so-called visible trade. So it didn't deal with international capital flows, it doesn't deal with labor flows, it doesn't deal with exchange rates. It's really about trade in goods, primarily manufactured goods and agricultural products. And the whole way that this system was set up was very much based on the approaches that the United States and the United Kingdom foresaw as being a successor to the system in place before World War II. So it really needs to be seen in the context of the approaches that the US and the UK would take. In particular, it is going to be a rules-based system, very much legal in its orientation, with specific commitments, and also with an underlying focus on markets, free markets, as a source of organization for the international arrangements. Now, there was a very limited role for developing countries in this GATT period. We'll see in a minute that there were many developing countries that were members of the GATT, but it is a broad statement. They had relatively limited involvement in the GATT per se. That is to say, from 1947 to 1994, there were fewer commitments that developing countries had in terms of trade liberalization. And this was part of what was called special and differential treatment, sometimes referred to as SDT, which is a view that developing countries' circumstances are fundamentally different, so that they wouldn't have to liberalize, open up their markets as much. And this is very much a part of the GATT structure, that you had commitments by higher income countries, the United States, Europe, Canada, later Japan, that were very different than one would expect for a country like India, for example. Now, having said that, there were a very large group of members of the GATT as of 1994, when it started the transition to the WTO. Here are a number of countries with the dates that they've joined, and you'll notice that many developing countries were members right from the beginning. For example, India from 1948, Brazil 1948. So it wasn't as if important developing countries were not full members of the GATT, they just didn't participate in the process quite as much as the developed world. It's also worth noting that three important countries that were not members of the GATT even in 1994 and only later joined the WTO are China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So a term that you'll often hear in reference to the GATT are so-called GATT rounds. This is jargon for a set of trade negotiations among the GATT members. A couple of things to keep in mind about this. One is that the negotiations very much were conducted with the idea that if I open my market, I get access to yours. Unilateral liberalization was not part of the mindset, if you will, of GATT members. Instead, I will give up my restrictions so that I can gain access to your market by my exporters. So it's very much a mercantilist way of viewing the world. In various rounds, the tariff or trade liberalization was based on either formulas, say reducing all your tariffs by 10%, or specific offers. For example, that a country would say, I will reduce my tariffs on steel if you reduce your tariffs on autos, so sometimes sector specific. And there were a number of important rounds of trade negotiations, and I'll just mention three here. One is the Kennedy round in the early 1960s. The other is the Tokyo round in the 1970s, both of which involved really important levels of trade liberalization, openness, especially among the developed world. The Uruguay round was important in that it led to the establishment of the WTO. So the Uruguay round launched in 1986 in Uruguay, completed in 1994 after long, torturous negotiations. And one thing that was very interesting and different about the Uruguay round is that the final package was seen as a single undertaking. Now, what do I mean by that? That means it was take it or leave it. If you join up with one aspect of the negotiated arrangements, you have to agree to everything. This was a period in the mid-1990s where the Washington Consensus was very strong. Developing countries of the former Soviet bloc, all joining in the efforts to liberalize trade, very much seen as a key part of the prospects for economic growth. And so there was a strong sentiment at the time to have broad liberalization in the developed and developing world. Now, this is quite different from the way the GATT worked in terms of the negotiations. There it was kind of a pick or choose kind of arrangement. If I don't like this aspect of the GATT agreements, say commitments on subsidies, I'm just not going to sign. So especially developing countries would pick only certain parts of the GATT to agree to adhere to. So that meant a much more of a patchwork of arrangements across the world. The WTO was set up in the Uruguay round through a single undertaking. Everybody agreed to everything. And if you didn't join the WTO, you didn't get some of the benefits. It was really all or nothing. Now, a couple of important results that came out of the Uruguay round. One, basic trade-off between developed and developing countries. Developed countries agreed to phase out a system of quotas on textiles and clothing, which had been in place for a number of decades. This was something that developing countries really wanted to phase out. They wanted to access in these labor-intensive products to the developed country markets. So that was something very much that developing countries wanted. The developed countries also agreed to some new restrictions on agricultural protection. Agriculture had been really an exception to many of the GATT rules. With the Uruguay round, there was greater access. Now, not full access. There was still important domestic production subsidies and tariffs on a number of agricultural products, but agricultural products were really brought into the system and the commitments in the Uruguay round, also of interest to developing countries. Now, what did developed countries get out of this? The lower income countries agreed to two important changes in their commitments. One, that there would now be commitments to services. Up until now, it had really been goods, manufactured goods and agricultural goods. Now there's at least some commitments on services. That includes financial services, insurance services, accounting services, various types of things that were very important to developed country interests, especially the United States, but also Europe. The other aspect that was brought into the WTO system was TRIPS, the trade-related international intellectual property right commitments, so that there was, for the first time, agreements in the WTO for countries to adhere to patent protections, copyright protections, and so forth. Now, I don't have time to talk about this now, but it should be clear that the least developed countries, the poorest countries, did not have the full range of commitments on services and in particular on TRIPS, but at least it established in principle that these would be brought into international commitments by the broad international community. Three other things that were very important. One is the basic establishment of the institution, the World Trade Organization. This is in some ways important, other ways not. It was still housed in Geneva, still in the same building, but there was a more permanent arrangement for the WTO. There was also an important reform of the dispute settlement system, which I'll discuss in a few moments, of how to arbitrate difficulties among countries. And one thing that's important to note about this is that if you weren't a member of the WTO when the Uruguay round was completed, you then had to agree to all of the commitments that all the other members had agreed to in the Uruguay round. So that, for example, when China joins at the turn of 2000, completed in 2001, they did not get to reopen all of the commitments in the Uruguay round. They had to accept all of that as a fait accompli. So members that join later have to deal with the results in place, and in fact had to join the WTO with certain other commitments as part of an accession process.